Now, I'd like to give the floor to Kit. Ian is somewhere around, and he said to her, I plan to bring a British Parliament member to you, but they all go for Easter holidays, and I cannot find anybody till the last moment. And suddenly, downstairs I see Sam, and I thought that he probably was a member of our group. He said, no, I'm a member of British Parliament.
It's always a tremendous pleasure for me to come to seminars at the school, even after 11 and a bit years. And I tell you why. It happened last night when Sasha asked you all where you were coming from, and he asked you to put your hands up as to how many times you've been. Was this the first time? And a forest of hands went up. This was your first time. I once was a university lecturer, and when I got into Parliament, somebody then asked me, did I ever regret not carrying on as a university lecturer at the University of Edinburgh? And I said, well, obviously not really. I mean, the horizons which being a member of Parliament open to you are almost infinite. But the great advantage of being a university lecturer is that as one grows older, gracefully or otherwise, the people that you're involved with all your life are the same age. Because every year you get the same generation of 19, 20-year-olds, and it really helps to keep you younger, and it keeps you mentally active. And it's a great feature of having the privilege of working in the university. And that is what is happening to the Moscow School. Every year over a decade or more, every time I come, the young people of Russia are here and from all over Russia. And it is the remarkable achievement, what the school is founded on, in fact, is doing that, bringing people together from this huge continental country, which somebody once said to me, a very distinguished person speaking here, is possibly too big to be a country. And this school has brought together the young elites from different parts of this country. And some of them, through the network of the school, as with me, have gained friendships and connections of inestimable value, which you will keep. I'm a member of the Conservative Party, and so is Sam, and this is relevant to us because the Conservative Party was out of opposition for over a decade, and there became a growing awareness that the party was out of touch, that it was very much the same sort of people that it was selecting for its parliamentary constituencies, that its thinking was not in tune with the new generations in Britain. And one of the great achievements of David Cameron as leader of the party and now Prime Minister was to attempt that difficult process of reshaping a party which has been in existence for 500 years. So we have here an example. The Conservative philosophy is that party and government are there to stimulate achievement, to encourage success, and to reward success. And Sam has been a great success already, and he's only 35. Getting into Oxford, he became the president of the Oxford Union, the debating society in the whole of the university world, which has trained many, many politicians and leaders of political parties. And after that, he graduated obviously very well and went into the city to Goldman Sachs, where he's nearly 6 years in mergers and acquisitions. Was obviously with Goldman Sachs very successful. And thereafter set himself up as an entrepreneur, creating companies in the training industry and particularly the internet. And then in 2010, he got elected, and not just elected as so many are, you know, a flash in the pan, you get carried on by the public opinion swirling around and carrying people in and just winning. He won by, nearly 60% of the vote, I think I recall, in a very conservative constituency south of London, a very beautiful area, full of very prosperous professional and business people. And in Parliament, he's on the Select Committee, the All-Party Parliamentary Committee for International Development. But within the party machine and the government machine, he's on some key committees on policy issues, and particularly in the Treasury, working to the Chancellor on how do you stimulate the growth of small businesses, how do you encourage entrepreneurship, and find the resources, the banking capability that will stimulate and drive the economy through the growth of small into medium businesses. And it's on that, therefore, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce you, Sam Ghiba.
Maybe he will help us with fundraising.
Lena has said he's just the right person to help the school start raising funds. And I think he'll be on the phone next week to Goldman Sachs. Sam Ghiba.
Dobry dzień. Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, Keith has raised your expectations so highly with that introduction that not only am I very flattered, but I just hope that I don't disappoint you with the expectations that he's raised. Looking at me, none of you would believe it if I told you that I'm from a 14th century Vladivostok family, you know, and you'll be right. Not an expert on Russia. This is my first trip to Russia, and the Gulf of Finland couldn't be further away from Ghana, where I grew up. So why am I here during my Easter holidays? The first one is a very simple one and a sense of curiosity. You know, the opportunity to see, in some small way, a great country. It's definitely tempting. But also one of the things Keith mentioned to me when he introduced, you know, the Moscow School of Political Science to me was the passion for ideas, its history, and what it's been doing. And certainly the opportunity to sit down and to listen. It's something that comes quite hard to one once you've been a politician, even for a short while. But definitely the opportunity to listen, to share ideas, and to see what is happening made this a very tempting offer, and a second reason why I took it. But a third reason is, as Keith pointed out, I'm not as young as I look. Elaine thought I was 25, and I said I'm 35, and she said, "Are you really sure you are 35?" And I said, well, the good thing is when I'm 60, hopefully I'll still look young. But and the third reason why I thought, having come here, it's so great is that I think it's fair to say that I'm not the same generation as most of you here. And I'd like to share with you my experiences on how I think we can get economic growth, but also prosperity, which is critical to our futures. And it's very normal for most of us to think it's politicians, it's the older generation that have to deliver it. I happen to believe that we can take control of our own destinies, and it's one of the reasons why I definitely wanted to go into politics. Like most people, my views are informed by the nature of my upbringing and background. I was born in the UK to a doctor and a nurse, but I moved to Ghana when I was 6 years old, Ghana in West Africa, after my parents separated. My mother brought three of us up on her own, and she wanted to give us the best. So what she did is she gave up her career as a nurse to start a small business. I lived in Ghana for 10 years, and when I was 16, I moved back to England. I finished my high school, and as Keith said, went to Oxford, where I read philosophy, which anybody who's read it before knows is not a very practical subject. But it still got me a job in investment banking, working in mergers and acquisitions. But after 5.5 years, I decided to strike out on my own and get involved in small businesses, where I had some good experiences and some bad experiences. So I've been in big companies, I've been in small companies. And one of the things about being in small businesses is you make the decisions and the buck stops with you. It's not about getting on with your boss. It's not about being on the right side of your boss. It's about really working hard day in and day out. So I learned a lot doing in that. And in 2010, I realized, obviously, a long-held ambition to become a member of parliament in the UK. And it's something that I feel very privileged to have achieved, especially as Keith pointed out, having been born in the UK, lived outside of the UK and gone back. I'm very pleased. And I think David Cameron, as Keith mentioned, the Prime Minister and leader of the party, did a great job in encouraging people like me to get involved in politics and enter Parliament. But the point I'll make there, having done it and looking at all of you here is, I guess, don't let anybody tell you that you can't do it if you really want to. If you want to, whatever you want to do, you might as well go ahead and try as hard as you can. And if it doesn't work the first time, the second time, or the third time, it will eventually if you keep trying. But I'm here to talk about something much wider than that. And the way I'll frame the discussion today is moving on from what we've been discussing in the last few days, which I would say has been about politics, it's been about society, and it's been about the media. I'm going to focus on the economy, but specifically, how do we fashion an economic system that generates sustainable growth and benefits the many and not the few? And by that, what I mean is where success comes not from having the right contacts, not from being in the right clique, but hard work and endeavor and enterprise is allowed to flourish. My answer, partly based on my own life story, which is another reason why I started off with that, is that we need to create a culture of optimism and a culture where individual endeavor is rewarded and allowed to flourish. But before jumping to the answer, maybe it's important to understand the problem that we're trying to address. For many young people settling in the West today, today's world doesn't feel like a world that encourages aspiration or is just in terms of the outcomes that come out economically. Wealth and power seems concentrated in the hands of very few people. For the vast majority of people, stagnant wages and falling living standards is the reality of life. And the situation is stark when you look at the predicament of young people across Western Europe today. Many have higher qualifications than their parents did, and yet the high levels of youth unemployment is a challenge for them to enjoy anywhere near the same living standards as their parents did. In the last week, we've had in the news the numbers from Spain, where something like over 45% of young people are unemployed. And that is a really seriously dire situation in which to find ourselves. So that's the nature of the problem. Why does the problem exist? The Occupy movement, the international protest movement directed at social and economic equality, blames capitalism for the current state of affairs. For them, big corporations and the global financial system control the world in an unstable way that disproportionately benefits the minority and undermines democracy. In other words, it's the 1% that are doing bad by the 99%, as they say. But these are really, in my view, old ideas that have found a new form of expression. Naomi Klein's book, No Logo, which you could describe as the cultural manifesto of the Occupy movement, was published in 1999 and was really, used by the anti-globalization movement. That was the reference point for it. But you can't just dismiss what they're saying as these are old ideas without a focus that have just found a new form of expression. When, I was in Hong Kong in December, and in Hong Kong, of all places, found tents next to the HSBC building with people protesting about capitalism. The financial crisis, and the reason why you can't dismiss it is that the financial crisis and the ideas that shaped our politics and policies for the last 30 years has really undermined our confidence in capitalism. The simple view was that governments are bad and deregulation in markets are good. Now, those ideas seem as outdated as communism did in 1989. The very banks that championed limited government interference, that wanted light touch regulation, are the same banks that are going cap in hand to governments and are having billions, in fact trillions, of taxpayers' money being poured into them because they become too big to fail. And the current situation gives lie to the comments by Ronald Reagan, the former US president, who said, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I am from the government and I'm here to help." I was in Washington, D.C. when Lehman Brothers, the US investment bank, went bust. And at the time I was trying to raise finance for a business I was involved in. And it was great, it was interesting, not great, seeing what was happening in the US as policymakers tried to grapple with a world in which the global financial system was teetering on the edge. And I didn't think I grasped the full extent of the problem, because I then got on the phone to the people I was trying to raise money from in London to say, are you still going to be investing in this business? And the reply I got back was, Sam, we don't even know whether there's going to be a financial system in 2 weeks' time. Your company can wait. So that is how dangerous it looked in 2008. Capitalism seemed to have exhausted itself. And even in the UK, we see the consequences of what has happened from the financial crisis that has triggered a recession. We've seen a very big change in attitudes. Today in Britain, it will be a very brave politician who would say what a Labour politician, a left-wing politician, was able to say in the 90s. I don't mind people getting filthy rich. Because people have become very suspicious of the wealthy. Are they making their wealth at the expense of the many? In the US, which some would describe as the Mecca of capitalism, Mitt Romney, the former governor and businessman vying to be the Republican presidential candidate, is having to defend himself for being too rich. And you've got Republicans who are on the right, not people on the left, asking whether he's too rich to become president at a time like this. And that just shows the sea change in attitudes that we've seen since the financial crisis began. Attitudes towards inequality have changed dramatically. I used to see newspaper headlines in the mid-90s, early 2000s, where bankers were described as superheroes, rainmakers. Their glamour parties were covered in the newspapers. And now, the question people are asking is, are these people being rewarded for failure? Is it right if you have a capitalist system where if the banks do well, these people get paid huge bonuses, but if they do badly, the taxpayer picks up the tab? Surely, the public thinks, and I think quite rightly, that can't be right. So people are really not only suspicious of wealth, but also really anti-rewards for failure. Nobody, I think in my mind, quibbles with Mark Zuckerberg floating his company and making billions of dollars. Because the sense is he built, the reality is he built a company, dropped out of university to do so, and today if it's successful, surely he should get the rewards for it. But the sense that there is an elite who gained the system for their advantage, I think is what the public are angry about, certainly in the West. And so today, marginal tax rates have become a big issue for debate, for example, in Britain. We recently had our budget, and the Chancellor dropped the top rate of income tax from 50p to 45p. And that was, even though the 50p tax rate was a temporary measure originally, was a big source of contention. Because people believe that in a time of austerity, the rich should share the burden, not just those who are not well off. So to summarize the problem, we've got a situation where for many young people, and I use young people because it's starkest, but the problem is not just about young people, they cannot aspire to the lives that their parents have lived, even though they've studied hard, they've worked hard, and have higher and more qualifications. We have a situation where capitalism, the system that we have grown to believe, can bring prosperity to all, is seriously discredited. And we have a change in the political landscape where people are asking for more government intervention, for the well-off to share in the burden of austerity, and are very much against huge bonuses, certainly in the financial sector, that reward failure. But it's always easy to talk about problems. What are the solutions? In fact, are there any? What are the alternatives? And I think in this I have an unlikely ally. In March 1919, faced with another economic crisis, Lenin, of all people, discussed the dire straits of capitalism. He was, however, unwilling to write its epitaph. What he said was, to believe that there is no way out of the present crisis of capitalism is an error. And on this, and perhaps only this issue, I agree with him. Mainly because history proves that that verdict was right. After the problems of the 1920s and the 1930s, the dynamism of capitalism meant a lot of those countries, including the US, that experienced the Great Depression, powered on to huge and successful growth after the Second World War. But we live in a different era now. And as we consider alternatives, one of the big arguments at the moment is that state capitalism, which melds the power of the state with the power of capitalism, may be the answer. In a state capitalist system, governments pick winners, governments promote economic growth, but it's come back with a new form. Governments embracing globalization. You've got state-owned companies being listed on the stock market. It's, in fact, the sort of capitalism you see in varying forms amongst the BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And in the UK, one of the big political debates is whether the UK should have an industrial policy that is similar to this. Should we have a state-owned investment bank that backs winners? Should the government be picking sectors in which we can do well and supporting them as a way to create economic growth and come out of this crisis? And when you look at the success that the BRIC countries are achieving at the moment, that seems incredibly tempting. China's GDP over the last 30 years has grown by an average of 9.5% a year. Today, China boasts the world's second biggest economy and the largest market for many consumer goods. Someone said in one of the sessions yesterday, is there nothing good about Russia? I think in this respect there is a lot that is good about Russia. I was reading the Financial Times on my way here, and the leading financial and economics newspaper has on its Lex column, How to Buy Russia. It's actually advertising the Russian economic miracle. It talks about Russian GDP at 4.3% last year, a tad under 4%. The oil price at $120 a barrel is also $5 above the level required to balance the budget. So it looks like the story for Russia, in other words, the story for state capitalism, is compelling and one that we should all adopt as a measure of creating rising prosperity. Just to develop that point further, the 13 biggest oil firms, which between them have a grip on more than 3/4 of the world's oil reserves, are all state-backed. Interestingly, though, the state owns shares in these companies rather than directly controlling them as it would have during the communist period. The biggest natural gas company in the world is Gazprom, and Sberbank, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is Europe's third largest bank by market capitalization. So there is a lot of good news if you're a financial investor about Russia. But I believe that there are challenges around this form of capitalism in the long term. A growth rate of 4.3% that Russia has cannot be sniffed at. If in the West 1% growth is what we are arguing over, so we cannot really sniff at this. But Russia is in a unique position. You've got huge natural resources. In some ways, you're catching up with the West in terms of your growth, and so not all countries have either those resources or are in a similar catch-up position, and so can adopt the same style of capitalism. The option is not open to every country now. In fact, Japan had its time, Britain had its time, the US had its time, when they were in the situation that Russia finds itself in today. But also there is the question of innovation. One of the things that powers capitalism forward is innovation, where individuals wittingly or unwittingly try new ideas, pursue them, and come up with new companies, new businesses, and grow them. The state is not really known to be an engine for innovation. And it makes sense. When you've got a company that employs hundreds of thousands of people with some degree of political interference, some degree of political meddling, that over time becomes more, that employs more corporate bureaucrat type people. It is not really the engine for innovation in the same way. But also what you have with huge state companies over time is that it becomes a question of how do you climb the corporate ladder in order to be successful. So the question is whether that sort of corporate capitalism, whether it's within a state-controlled company or whether it's a large investment bank, in the West, or whether it's a large corporate, can really be the engine for the sort of growth that helps the many, but not the few who manage to work their way to the top of these companies. In the long term, I think if we want individuals to flourish, if we want the proceeds of growth to be shared with the many, innovation should be at the core of economic activity. And we need a system, therefore, in which entrepreneurship dominates. And what do I mean by entrepreneurship? One Harvard University professor defined it 37 years ago as the pursuit of opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. The pursuit of opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. What that means is that entrepreneurship does not rely on the contacts of the individual. Entrepreneurship, although it can be helpful, doesn't rely necessarily on being on the right side of the government. But entrepreneurship at its core, it's about an individual coming up with an idea to pursue something and really working hard at it and making it successful. I would say that, the Moscow School of Political Science is an example of pursuing an opportunity without regard to the resources currently controlled. Someone conceives of an idea, starts out with it around their kitchen table, works at it for 20 years, trying to raise funds from lots of different sources, trying to get different people to help, roping in alumni, roping in, a former British MP, doing everything they can to build the organization. And then you look back 20 years and you've helped 20,000 people through the process. That is at its core what entrepreneurship is about. And I use that example specifically because I think entrepreneurs are not people who always set out just to make money. They are people who want to build something and make something successful. And that is why I think it's an incredibly powerful thing to have at the core of one's society. But when we think of entrepreneurs, and another reason why I use that example, we think of Bill Gates, we think of your Mark Zuckerbergs of this world, we think of Steve Jobs of Apple, built a company, got thrown out of the company, built another company, came back, and today, whether it's the iPad, the iPod, or the Mac computers, dominates our consumption of consumer electronics. Yeah, those are the ones that make it, alongside a lot of people fail. But what is interesting is that the reason why I use the example of the Moscow School of Economics and Political Science is that you don't have to be a Mark Zuckerberg to be an entrepreneur and also to build something that is successful. You don't need to be outgoing, nor does it mind whether you're a wallflower. There's no surprise that a lot of the demographic analysis shows that people who are highly entrepreneurial start out poor. I.e., they don't have the resources, but what they've got is they've got an idea and they've got a vision. So, listening to the Q&A session, the question and answer session, at the end of yesterday, there are people here who are in media, there are people here who are in government, and all of them could be entrepreneurs in different ways. The social media experts here could be the newspaper barons of tomorrow. The people who work in government today could be the ones that come up with new ideas about how governments can deliver services. It doesn't just have to be in the private sector. But there is something at its core, which is that it's a mindset that turns risk into opportunity. And I came across a quote while researching this that I'd like to share with you about the mindset of someone who's truly entrepreneurial, as opposed to the mindset of someone who climbs a corporate ladder. I mean, that has its place, but just to elucidate the point. Every time you want to make an important decision, there are two possible courses. You can look at the array of choices that present themselves and then try to make it fit. Or you can do what the true entrepreneur does. Figure out the best conceivable option and then make it happen. And that is what makes entrepreneurship so hard. It's much easier to look at two options and pick the best of two than to try to create your own world and make it happen. But it's also what makes it, I believe, absolutely necessary in an economy that's going to thrive and succeed. Because if we all want to pick the best available option of what the world is today, then we don't really have true progress. But also, we've got to realize that in trying to make things happen in that way, as I hinted a few minutes ago, you have a lot of failures along the way. Going back to the social networking example, which I've tried to develop so far, you wouldn't have a Facebook today if you didn't have a Friendster, if you didn't have a Friends Reunited in the UK, or if you didn't have MySpace. What you have today has built on the previous, in some cases failures, in some cases partial successes that were there before. But that's part of the entrepreneurial mindset. And so the entrepreneurial mindset has to be, of necessity, therefore, an optimistic one. Because the good thing, but also the bad thing about being optimistic, is you tend to see reality differently. After the current financial crisis, there is a huge move that we should all be realistic. We should set our sights a lot lower. We cannot expect the growth or prosperity that our parents had. You know, you don't want to take risk. Just do what you can and just make life work. That's not an optimistic mindset. The optimistic mindset is the one that challenges the status quo. And I think that optimistic mindset is core to entrepreneurship. Another reason why I think entrepreneurship is important as the way to create the growth for the many and not the few is that entrepreneurial firms tend to be very different. They focus on teams rather than hierarchy. Decision making is much faster rather than being all about deliberation. And people become successful in those companies because they own a share in the company, and so they have an interest in building the company and making it successful. You know, in my experience, one of the big difficult things is attracting talent if you've got an entrepreneurial business. And if you want good people to work for you and you can't pay them the competitive rates that established companies would do, you end up having to give them a share of the company. Now, that kind of share ownership changes people from being employees who turn up to work, do their bit, and then go home and forget about the business. They really share in the vision of the company. And I think that is why, another reason why an entrepreneurial mindset economy is important. But as a system for the economy, one of the important things about it is I think entrepreneurial companies are much better at creating new jobs. There's a piece of research that a think tank in the UK called Nesta did. And they found out that in the UK, 50% of the jobs are created by 6% of the companies that are fast growing and that are innovative and that are trying new things. And so if you want to create employment, one of the things you've got to do is create an entrepreneurial society. But that relies on having open competition. You know, it relies on having flexibility. It relies on having the rule of law and of contract being sacrosanct. It relies on having tax rates that make it interesting and exciting for people to actually start up. So rather than government crowding and stopping people from doing this, government should encourage entrepreneurship. So you can see, going back to the alternatives that I posed earlier on, that a system in which entrepreneurship dominates is very different to state-run corporate capitalism, certainly as it exists today. Because it doesn't rely on an inner circle. You can't, in fact, plan it in the same way. With an entrepreneurial society, you'd have someone from Siberia coming up with a solution to a problem that people in Siberia experience. And you'd have someone, you know, in Moscow coming up with a different solution to challenges there. You can't predict it. The UK became one of the dominant telecoms players in the 90s and 2000s. And what is interesting is that no government official planned it. We went through privatizations. And, nobody would have said when we went through those privatizations that we were going to be dominant in telecoms. But, Vodafone, Orange, and all these companies, once they were freed and became entrepreneurial companies, went into new markets, had their problems along the way, but became leaders in their fields. And so I firmly believe, going back to where we started, from my own life, but also in terms of where we are today, if we are to address the problem that the Occupy movement pose, I don't think raging against capitalism is the answer. Capitalism has delivered prosperity, huge prosperity over the years. What I think we need to do is refashion it so that it works for the many and not the few. Thank you.
Да, именно так. Я просто радуюсь тому, сколько вопросов.
I really about how many questions you have, and I think without waiting for the end of the session, I think before the Q&A session, we can congratulate our guest with his debut in Moscow School of Political Studies. That was a great presentation, and now let's take 3 questions at a time. You're welcome. You never said a word before in this session. Who are you? And colleagues, we want to ask you, please speak slowly and distinctly. Richenska Irina from Krasnodar. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting, and in your speech you spoke about the elites that take advantage of their situation for personal benefits, and I want to think about our internal policy. A little while ago we passed a law that forbade FSB employees to have property which is registered outside of the country. There will be a law passed for the civil servants to buy foreign-made cars or vehicles. Do you think such measures could be effective in the context of struggle against corruption and certain injustice and fairness, and what kind of measures would you suggest or propose? Here, I want to ask you 2 things. First of all, I asked you to speak distinctly and slowly, which you did not. And you pronounced in such a manner that our colleagues could not understand the word because it was impossible to translate what you were trying to say.
Понятно. В общем, еще и сопутствующие шумы есть, которые мешают. С микрофонами надо работать тоже аккуратнее. Ира, вторая, не то что претензия, а просто замечание.
Now our experts are high-grade specialists. It does mean that you can ask them questions about everything. What kind of a law with regard to the FSB secret police property? And the deputy of the parliament will speak about that. He may have an opinion about that, but he doesn't know much about the Russian secret police and their properties. Now, Ira, and you can carry on. You can ask your questions in the future as well. Now, please. Evgenia Kharmova from Tatarstan. Listening to you, I began to understand that we have very much in common. We are of the same age. We know about Vladimir Lenin, and we understand the meaning of the youth, significance of the youth. My question to you would be Vladimir Lenin, whom you mentioned. He referred to the youth as a reserve of society, social reserve kind of, and the deputy, a member of parliament in the UK, Sam Ghima, in his daily activities. What do you do with that reserve, if you have it? Your youth reserve. A reserve. Lenin spoke about the reserve, youth being reserve. No comment. Now another question from Belarus. And one more request, please. Can you ask a question so that he should have translated from English into English in the proper English.
Around it. So do you
Коллеги, понимаете, дело в том, что когда вы цитируете Ленина,
Guys, when you quote Lenin to the people who were elected to British Parliament 2 years ago, probably conceptual issues arise, and I would, colleagues, it's very much like saying that the trade unions is kind of a drive belt of the Communist Party, and for the British culture it would be difficult to comprehend the role of the trade unions in that sense. So please use proper Russian. I want to implore to you.
я
I will try to repeat it. What you wanted to ask?
Could you speak through the translation and say that one of the problems is
Одна из проблем.
very close to the mic, and if you speak like this, it comes around the room, and with one earphone we hear more noise than we can hear the translation. That's the real problem of both those last. You have to be further away from the mic.
цитируйте Ленина сколько хотите, короче говоря. Главное, чтобы расстояние было нормально.
Сэм, как вы работаете с молодыми?
And how do you work with young people? How do you treat the young people? Excellent question. Excellent question. Easy to understand.
Fine. We'll end this series of questions at that. Mr. Gima. All right. One other question. You have said you have talked a bit about the BRIC countries. There's a little bit of a rhetoric about abandoning dollar and euro as the world reserve currencies. Do you believe that the swiftly developing countries may abolish or abandon US dollar and euro as the reserve currencies, and may elect, let us say, the yuan as the international reserve currency? Do you believe that it is entirely possible for the world currencies to change in terms of reserve currencies? Good. Well, I can.
Thank you for that, and sorry for the problems with the questions. Three questions, taking the third one first about reserve currencies and abandoning the dollar. Do I see that as possible? Of course, everything is possible, but I don't see that as something happening anytime soon. I mean, I think China's done quite well having its currency pegged to the dollar. The bigger question, though, for those of us who are not economics geeks, is with the BRIC countries, we're going to see a very big change in the global balance of power. For example, there are a lot of arguments around Brazil, for example, not having a seat on the UN Security Council. And I think what we're seeing is in the West, today we rely on the BRIC countries as destination for our exports. We're relying on these countries investing their surplus capital in infrastructure in our companies. So, the UK Chancellor has made no secret of the fact, Chancellor of the Exchequer, that we want to get foreign investment from sovereign wealth funds into the UK. And the question is, as these countries grow in the way they are, can we still have a situation where, in terms of the global seats of economic and political power, it is still dominated by the victors, basically, after the Second World War? So I think what we're going to see in the next 10, 20 years is a big change around the global seats of economic and political power. Whether, reserve currency is one of those, we're yet to see. But I think you're right in terms of posing the question. The other question, and I hope that I've got this right, given that she asked it twice, which is around how do you treat young people? Is that it? How do you treat young people? And well, that's quite a broad question. I think one of the things we need to do is, certainly when I look in the UK and the media, a lot of the time when you see young people in the media, it's not really positive. You know, you see young people causing trouble, etc. And I think we need to change our attitude towards young people and in terms of what they can and cannot do. And politicians always struggle to find a way to communicate with young people. And one of the fashionable ways of doing it is if you're a senior politician and you're a man over a certain age, you know, if you don't wear a tie and a suit, it means you are in with the young people, and that's sufficient. And then what we need to do is we need proper engagement with the challenges of young people that is not just cosmetic. You know, young people have serious concerns in the UK in terms of university fees. You know, university fees are going up for understandable reasons, in terms of employment opportunities, but also the intergenerational burden. We have a huge level of debt that needs to be paid off. The baby boomer generation, people born in the 50s and 60s, have done very well for themselves, but it's today's young people that are going to benefit from it. So I think politically, political success in the future would have to depend to some extent, or to a large extent, on how politicians can engage with not just disaffected young people, but young people who have problems that are not ordinarily addressed by politicians. And I hope that is satisfactory. If not, do come back and I'll be willing to sort of answer it further. And to the first question, without going into the detail of laws in Russia, what I would say is, you know, corruption is antithetical to having free and open markets where contracts are awarded on the price mechanism rather than based on contacts. That's all I'll say on that.
Большое дополнение, прошу.
May I just add something which struck me today listening to the BBC World News, which is that Russia has just sold the Indian government its first nuclear-powered submarine. Now, why is that? That's because it's going to be stationed off the east coast of India, and the threat is China. I've found it when I've been in Siberia and Novosibirsk and Irkutsk and places, I won't go into the detail, the relationship of Russia and China either, but do you really think that the BRIC economies are going to want to have a common currency that's controlled by the Chinese?
Давайте следующий раунд вопросов, учитывая ошибки предыдущего тура. Прошу, сударыня.
Alena Kuznetsova, Magnitogorsk.
Alena,
It concerns jurisprudence in the United Kingdom. We know that Constitution is unwritten in Great Britain. It is based on precedents on the previous decided cases. So the question is, how do the courts decide cases now when new technologies are involved?
Так, коллега, вот прямо напротив меня, второй ряд, прошу. Нет, я имею в виду активист.
thank you very much for this topic. As I understand, the old capitalism, and this is it appears that the spirit of entrepreneurship is somewhat eroding. Do you believe that the spirit of entrepreneurship is in any way discredited, or do you believe that it is still marching strong? What is a possible formula for the reanimation of the spirit of entrepreneurship in the modern world? A lady from Dagestan. she is the head of the Youth Parliament of Dagestan under the Legislative Assembly of that republic. And one of the functions of this youth parliament is to represent the interests of young people within the power bodies, through which young people may go through the social lifts. Is there an analogy in Britain, and how do the social and career lifts work for the young people? Do the young people in Britain participate? What's the culture of inclusion of them into the political process?
Thank you. Firstly, the question about the jurisprudence, I should put it. Yes, the UK has an unwritten constitution, which means that issues are decided based on case law rather than with reference to a written constitution. Now, your question is how do you then deal with challenges of new technologies? And I think that happens whether you've got a written constitution or you haven't. If anything, I would say that our system is based on case law is a lot more flexible in terms of responding to new challenges than to have a constitution that was written 200 years ago. That doesn't mean I don't support written constitutions. You know, countries have them, and if they work, they work. So, but I'm saying in terms of flexibility, I don't see that our system lacks flexibility at all. But new technologies are presenting a lot of challenges to the existing legal system. I think last week a gentleman was jailed for 56 days for making racially abusive comments on Twitter, for example. There is a lot of behavior that happens in social media that people really wouldn't do face to face. Because for a lot of people, you know, when they are on Facebook or when they're on Twitter, you know, on MySpace, they are not there as themselves, they have an avatar, they have a different name, and some people don't even realize that in making a comment, even if it's to friends, you are still publishing. And so there are a lot of people who not only misbehave, but accidentally sometimes fall foul of the law. And I think this is going to be an area that, you know, the legal system is going to have to wrestle with. Because in the case of the gentleman who was jailed for 56 days, it was a high-profile case. It was racial abuse about a footballer who collapsed during a football game. But that sort of abuse, we know, is happening on the internet every day. So where is the line between the law and how that sort of behavior happens? And also you've got issues of privacy. So I think it's something that the law is going to have to grapple with, but it applies irrespective of your legal system. The second question is about the spirit of entrepreneurship and what is the formula for creating it in this day and age. And I think it's a very good question. There is no easy way, I believe, to get people to become entrepreneurial. But there are things that the government can do. For example, making it easy for people to start businesses makes a huge difference to whether people are going to start them or not. You know, so there is academic research that looks at the ease of company formation and how that correlates to entrepreneurship. So that's the first start. The second thing is regulation and how complicated it is, especially for small businesses, to deal with it. If you're a small business and you have to spend a lot of time filling in forms for a bureaucracy and whilst at the same time managing your business and trying out a new idea, that actually doesn't help you at all. But the third and probably one of the most important things is access to finance. It makes a huge difference to whether or not you can get a venture off the ground if you've got money, right? The way it was defined, people can start out as entrepreneurs without the resources available. But if it's very difficult to get the finance you need to launch a business, it would make a lot of sense for a lot of people to actually stay employed than actually go out on their own. And that is why one of the things I've focused on since I got elected to Parliament is looking at access to finance for small businesses, whether it is equity investment or whether it's loans for a bank. And in the UK, we have a particular problem that 90% of bank lending is concentrated amongst 5 banks. So it's very uncompetitive, and as well as being highly concentrated, and a lot of small businesses struggle. So making it easy for finance to flow through the system, I think, makes a huge difference as to whether or not people will take the plunge. And the final thing I'll add to that is just business education. I think when I look back on my own life, it's no accident that I found it attractive becoming an entrepreneur, because that's what my mother did in order to bring us up. But there are a lot of students today going through the system who don't really understand the principles of business. For a lot of people who learn it, they learn it through their family. So if you want to create an entrepreneurial system, I think we need to factor in that sort of business education into our education system as well. The third question is about inclusion of young people in the political process in the UK. And there are many ways for young people to get involved in the political process in the UK. The question is whether they find it sufficiently enticing and interesting for them to do so. I mean, in the school system, for example, there are citizenship classes. They talk about people, they start electing people onto the class committee. I don't think that's the exact phrase. In the school system, I organise trips for a lot of schools in my constituency to come to Parliament. So throughout the school system, people are aware and conscious of our democracy and get involved. When there's a general election, schools have mock general elections in the school. There is a youth parliament in the UK as well. But I mean, we are at a stage where the real question, and we say we in the UK, the real question we need to ask ourselves is, despite all of this happening within the school system, why are so many young people turned off traditional politics? Or are they really turned off traditional politics? I mean, when you have issues like the Iraq War, you have a lot of young people engaged in it. When Parliament was debating to raise tuition fees for university students, we had something like 10, 20,000 people outside of Westminster. So they clearly are switched on to politics, but why do they not vote as much? Why are they not as engaged? And I think the problem doesn't lie with young people, the problem probably lies with politicians. And the fact that a lot of the time when we talk about politics, we talk about process. We talk about the process of politics rather than what we're trying to achieve. Rather than talk about how it's going to change things for people. And young people are no fools. They see through it as much as they see through it when their parents are trying to behave like they're like them. And they're like, no. Mum and dad, you're not like us. And they see through what politicians and other politicians are not connecting with them. So I think the real challenge with engaging young people in politics is really about politicians learning to connect in a real and authentic way. But that's not just a problem with young people. It's across the board.
Так, еще одну серию мы успеем. Сударыня, прошу.
We can manage just one other series of questions. Alexandra Naumenko from Stavropol. Well, taking into account your entrepreneurial experience or experience in business, could you give a very short summary as to what should be the usually the startup capital for a young man who wants to get a loan from a bank? Does he or she have to have some sort of collateral? And how many years should a businessman be in the market to be able to get a loan in the amount of 3 billion rubles? I'm sorry, she was not able to put it into Great British pounds. But Mr. Aliyev from Dagestan. I have great sympathy for your historical homeland, Ghana. And I remember I was a fan of Ghana's team at the World Soccer Cup. do you have any plans to run for prime ministerial office or become president of Ghana? Mr. Alexandrov from Karachaev, Cherkessia. What is your opinion about bioenergy and renewable sources of energy? And when could that be of importance in Russia? When could Russia... that's an interesting question.
I'll start with the fan club question first. The gentleman who asked when was I going to run for prime minister, whether I wanted to be president of Ghana, and Keith here whispered to me, "You've got a campaign team." Firstly, I am a British citizen. I grew up in Ghana. I've lived in the UK for half of my life, so the UK is my home. And I have no plans whatsoever to run for Prime Minister. I think I am incredibly fortunate that the first time I ran for Parliament I got elected. I'm really enjoying what I'm doing. And Keith, there's a point that Keith made that I thought is very interesting, which is the horizons that being a Member of Parliament opens to you. I mean, there's the opportunity to make a real difference to your constituents. But to be here and to share ideas with you, it's something that wouldn't be possible if I wasn't a Member of Parliament. And, I'm very grateful for where I am, to be honest. The next question, which I'll take, is how much experience and how much do you need to be in the market to raise finance for a new venture? Now, it all depends on the type of venture you've got. If your venture is a software business that would take 3 years to develop, and you wouldn't even know whether you make a single, ruble of revenue 5 years in, then no bank is going to lend to you, because banks, understandably, are very careful about their risk. Banks like to lend to relatively, where there is security available. So in that situation, you're wasting your time going to banks. What you need somebody who put in equity capital or risk capital into the business. And Facebook, for the first few years, made no money. And so if your business is that, a software type business, or even in the biotech industry where they spend years on drug discovery before they even know whether the drug is going to be successful, it requires a different type of investor. On the other hand, if your idea is to do with property, and banks still like, property even after the financial crisis, then that's the sort of thing that you can go to a bank for. So it depends entirely on the nature of the venture you're looking at. And in my experience, certainly in terms of how you go about it, I've seen, I've had some tough times doing it, and I've had some great times doing it. And Ronald Cohen, a leading British entrepreneur, says, you only fail when you stop trying. So to answer your question, how long should you be in the market for? Stick at it for as long as you believe in your idea. The third question, which is my opinion on bioenergy and renewables, specifically for Russia, I think the case for renewable energy and diversified sources of energy is certainly very compelling for us in the UK. Notwithstanding especially given the problems of climate change. Now, my view is that we're ultimately going to need a mix of energy sources. So we're going to need some renewable energy in there, we're going to need some wind there, but we're also going to need some nuclear energy in the UK if we're going to keep the lights on in 20 to 30 years' time. And I think that's, as far as Russia is concerned, is that for you have very different natural resources to the UK. My opinion is, if we're going to deal with climate change, we need to shift the way we consume energy and the energy resources. And that's something that, I would say we're looking at very seriously in the UK. And in Russia, I hope that you are as well.
Так, продолжаем. Коллега из Литвы имеет слово, прошу.
Mr. Žemaitis from Lithuania.
Thank you, firstly, for interesting presentation. And the first question I'd like to address you concerns economy. Could you say that entrepreneurship is that consensus point of Occupy marginals and the libertarian corporate heavyweights? Is the entrepreneurship the solution to that collision between two parts of society, which sometimes become quite influential? And the second question refers to you as a politician. Where do you see United Kingdom in European Union in short term and in long term, as we've seen a bit of a Eurosceptic British position in recent actions, especially referring fiscal policy, and where do you see Great Britain in European Union in some sort of term? Thanks.
Спасибо. Прошу, сударыня, вам слово. Да-да. Называется.
Miss Ilina from Yaroslavl. Housing is a major problem for young people in Russia. Does Britain have a similar problem, and what are the ways of trying to solve it? Mr. Tereshchenko from Novosibirsk. Well, thank you very much, Sam, for this very energetic and lively account. I can definitely see you've been able to impart your spirit of entrepreneurship to the audience, in my opinion. But what is the general attitude of the public to the starting businessmen, the young entrepreneurs or people who just enter this field? And my second question is if the big UK business participate in the social policies, and whether it is in any way socially responsible.
For those questions. Just to take the questions in random order, the housing is a major problem for young people. Yes, it is a problem in the UK as well. And the reason why it's a problem in the UK is twofold. Firstly, rents are very expensive. And because a lot of young people are struggling to get work, they end up living at home for longer than they plan to. So people finish university and they go home and they stay with their parents. But the second reason is also because of the way the housing market in the UK works, that the average house price is beyond a lot of people. But also banks are now, after the financial crisis, asking for huge deposits in order to buy a home. So if you want to buy a home that is even within your salary range, the bank would ask you for 30% of the value of the property. And so that's actually, if you think you're going to buy a property for £250,000, finding 30% of that as a deposit is not something that a lot of young people have lying under their mattress. And so if your parents can't help you with that, it becomes a problem. The average age in the UK at which people can own their own home has gone up to 37 at the moment. So it is a big problem. What can be done about it? One of the schemes that the government has recently launched to help with that is a discount scheme where the government teams up with developers and allows, to provide a huge discount, 95%. So you only need to find 5% or deposit to buy a home. And that's a big scheme that the government has actually launched yesterday that I think could make a huge difference. But another thing we need to do in the UK is just look at house building. One of the reasons why house prices are so high relative to average incomes is our planning laws are quite restrictive. And so you don't have the same supply of new homes as you should do. I think I came across a statistic that said house building in the UK is the lowest since about 1920 at the moment. But to answer your question, how are we resolving it? It's the government getting involved in helping young people to own their own home. That's what's been done in the UK. The other question about the UK in Europe and Euroscepticism, another very good question. I think certainly I'm speaking for the Conservative side. The view of our European position can be summed up as we want to be in Europe. 40 to 45% of UK exports are to Europe, but not run by Europe. The UK has no desire to be part of the Eurozone and didn't join and has no plan to join in the future. And, I think that is absolutely right. But do we see ourselves as an active member in Europe? Yes, we do. But I think what we want to know that we can determine as a country the aspects of the European project that work best for us. Now, going back to the discussion yesterday, where someone said, Europe is not an a la carte menu, that obviously brings the UK sometimes into conflict with other European countries. But I think the UK has got to do what is right for UK citizens. That is what elected politicians are there for. But the other definition that came out of the discussion yesterday was Europe as an idea and the values that we subscribe to. And I would say that there is no one that can question the UK's commitment to the values of the EU, whether it's tolerance, whether it's respect for human rights, etc. We were there very much at the beginning. We're still committed to those values and will always be. Now, your other question, which is the Occupy and the libertarian position. I mean, the analysis of the Occupy movement is that capitalism has failed. And if we didn't have capitalism and we didn't have these big branded corporations, we wouldn't be where we are today. My position is that capitalism, has had a shock, but needs to be refashioned. And there is no other system that has created as much prosperity as capitalism has. And so it's very different. My position is very different to where I'd say the Occupy movement is coming from. And the third question is about the attitude of the public to young people who are starting in business or people starting up in business generally. And I think that's a very interesting point because there's definitely a view there that, people who go out there and, try to start up businesses and start ventures, etc., are sort of addicted to risk, And it's certainly coming from, an African background, your parents want you to go and become a lawyer or a doctor, or an accountant. That's respectable and everybody knows what you do, or an engineer or something like that. The whole idea of being out there and sort of trying to, it's not really that welcome. But I think society is better off if you have people who are willing to break the mold, whether they are doctors who want to break the mold or people who want to break the mold in business. I think society is better off having those people, and it's something that should be encouraged. And also, but to encourage that, it means that we need to have a different attitude towards two things. One is wealth, but the other is failure. Not sniggering at people who do well, who build businesses and do well, because, that's not really as great as becoming CEO of a FTSE 100 or a multinational company. I think we need to have a positive attitude towards wealth creation. But we also need to have an open mind about adventure and risk-taking. Because without adventure, without risk-taking, we don't really have progress. And I think that is really what we should be very careful of, that in response to the financial crisis, as I was saying, we don't get to a position where we see all risk as bad. We had irrational exuberance that led to the markets behaving in the way they did, but there is, what I call optimism and a spirit of adventure, and that should definitely be encouraged. And I think the second part of your question was around socially responsible businesses. And yes, a lot of businesses in their own way try to be as socially responsible as possible, whether it's with regard to their supply chain, whether it's with regard to backing certain social projects. And I think it's a good thing for businesses to have what they call a double bottom line. You know, obviously, the primary responsibility of businesses is to their shareholders. And so you can't expect businesses to deliver the social goods that we need in our society.
Коллеги, к сожалению, истекло время, мы не сможем продолжать, потому что график наш таков, что мы просто не...
Unfortunately, we cannot keep on because, well, our schedule is too tight. But I think that we have to thank Mr. Gima for this session.